Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are doing a deep dive today into one of the most critical periods in the whole story of redemption. We're looking at that shift from the patriarchs, wandering around to the kingdom getting established in Canaan. And we're going to zero in on the book of Joshua. We have a really compelling stack of sources here that see this whole history as, well, not just a military record. It's more like a huge theological statement about one single central idea.
That's the perfect starting point. Our whole mission here is to really distill the core message these texts are giving us about how God rules. And when you really analyze these conquest stories, the focus is never, ever on how good Israel was at fighting or how moral they were. The question the sources are answering is this: how does Yahweh bring his kingdom into being in a fallen world? And the answer from all the material, it's completely unanimous. The kingdom is established only by grace and by divine strength. That has nothing to do with human virtue or, military might. In fact, it's often established in spite of them.
Right. And what's so insightful, looking at this material, is how the story is immediately tied backwards and forwards. This deep dive connects the failure of Adam and Eve in the first garden all the way to Israel getting set up in the Promised Land. Canaan becomes this sort of new garden, and Israel's failure there proves why a future perfect king is so necessary. Israel's whole history becomes this object lesson in, well, in sovereign grace.
It really is. It's the story of redemption getting its first physical address on earth, you could say. And if you want proof, absolute proof, that this whole thing is driven by God's choice and not human quality, well, you just have to look at the man chosen to start the whole covenant line, Abraham himself.
Okay, let's unpack that choice, because it is startling when you stop and think about it. The story of God's people starts not with some pillar of virtue, but with someone who was, frankly, steeped in paganism. This choice of Abraham is, it's the first and maybe the most powerful signal that God's rule works on grace alone. It just completely removes any idea of merit from page 1 of the national story.
And we don't have to guess about Abraham's spiritual state when he was called. It's not ambiguous. The sources have clear testimony, and it's delivered much later in the story by Joshua. When Joshua gathers all of Israel for his final speech, he says, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods."
And that detail is just, it's so critical that their great ancestor, the father of the faithful, was a polytheist.
Yeah.
An idolater living way out in Mesopotamia. It just obliterates the idea that God sort of scanned the earth, found the most righteous guy, and said, "You're the one." No, Abraham was found in his sins, serving other gods.
That is the whole theological insight. The sources make a huge point that Yahweh rescued Abraham from that corrupt, idolatrous world by calling him out of it. Choosing an idolater served a very specific theological purpose. God chose someone with no spiritual potential, no inherent righteousness, to make it absolutely clear, crystal clear, that the kingdom and all the glory that came from it would be from his sovereign strength alone. It had nothing to do with human piety or any goodness in Abraham. If the root of the tree, Abraham, was salvaged from idolatry, then the branches, Israel, have absolutely no room to boast about themselves.
This gives us the perfect context for that analogy of the master sculpture that we found in our sources. If a sculptor wants to get all the credit for a masterpiece, they might pick a block of flawless, pure marble, right? Something that's already beautiful and full of potential. But the story of Abraham suggests God did the complete opposite.
Exactly. The sculptor chose a rough, unpromising rock from a pile of rubble. That's the idolater Abraham. It's a material with no natural beauty, and in fact, it was tainted by paganism. The choice wasn't based on the rock's value, not at all. So when the finished work, the covenant people, is finally displayed to the world, everyone knows the beauty and the quality belong completely to the sculptor's skill. That's God's grace. It has nothing to do with the potential of the rough rock, which is human merit. The material's contribution was zero.
And that first sovereign choice of Abraham was so needed because it marked a restart of God's entire plan of redemption. You really have to see it against the backdrop of just catastrophic human failure that came before it.
After the fall, human history was just on a relentless downward spiral. God had tried a reset with the flood, but the sources are quick to show that the flood didn't get rid of the inclination to sin. Right after the flood, what happens? Humanity gets together at the Tower of Babel. And what are they doing? Trying to build a city and a name for themselves. It was just rebellion and brick and mortar.
So humanity had proven it couldn't recover the ground lost in the garden. The whole race was, spiritually speaking, in an active alliance with the serpent, living for their own glory, disobeying the command to fill the earth under God's lordship.
That first promise of victory over evil, from Genesis 3.15, where the offspring of the woman would crush the serpent's head, well, it seemed impossibly distant.
Hmm.
Redemption required a divine intervention, a surgical and miraculous choice. So when God called Abraham, he set a long-term plan in motion, pledging three key things: land, children, or offspring, and a blessing that would reach the whole world. This was the first necessary step to produce the faithful offspring who would finally win that victory and restore God's rule. The history of Israel, which we see come to a head in Joshua, is really just the beginning of fulfilling these foundational, grace-driven pledges.
Okay, so let's jump forward a few centuries. We go from one man, Abraham, to this massive nation on the edge of Canaan, and we're in the book of Joshua. This is where we see the physical, tangible fulfillment of those pledges start to happen. The story moves forward in a big way here, especially with the promise of the land.
We see the realization of the covenant spoken to Abraham and then confirmed to Isaac and Jacob. The first promise, the offspring, it started almost comically slow. I mean, by the time Jacob's family gets to Egypt, the text says there were only about 70 people. But the exponential growth in Egypt right before the Exodus proved that this wasn't about human effort or, fertility. It was about a divine decree.
That slow start in Genesis actually reinforces the grace principle again, doesn't it? It proves the kingdom isn't built on, predictable human efficiency or population trends. It's built on God's supernatural timing.
Precisely. And that leads right to the land. This is the second element of the promise that Joshua is tasked with bringing about. And the possession of Canaan is always shown as this stunning, totally undeserved gift. It wasn't because Israel was mighty or morally better than anyone else. Deuteronomy, which is kind of the prologue to Joshua, says it so clearly. It is not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you are going in to possess their land. It was only because of Yahweh's sovereign covenant love.
And what really drives home this idea of unearned grace is just how lavish the provision was. The sources really lean into this. Israel was walking into a developed territory. The story in Joshua reminds them they moved into cities they did not build, they used wells they did not dig, and they enjoyed vineyards and olive orchards they did not plant.
It's the ultimate sovereign grant. Think of it like that dream home analogy. You don't just win a plot of empty land. You win a fully furnished, high-tech compound, already stocked with food and infrastructure. The previous tenants, the Canaanites, are cleared out, and you just get the keys. Israel didn't earn the land, they didn't pay for the materials, they didn't even plant the gardens. They inherited a fully operational, rich headquarters designed for them to live under Yahweh's rule.
So we have to see this as more than just real estate. This land wasn't just a spot on a map, it had this deep theological meaning that ties all the way back to the beginning of the human story.
The sources make that connection very explicit. The land was like the Garden of Eden for Adam and Eve. Canaan was supposed to be an outpost of Yahweh's lordship, the place where the king would live among his people. Israel was put there as a corporate new Adam, a group of vice-regents whose job was to live in perfect covenant faithfulness and extend God's good rule out to the rest of the world.
But before this corporate Adam could take possession and start ruling, they had to be in a right relationship with their king. That's what happened at Gilgal.
Indeed. Before the first battle, before they even tasted the fruit of the land, they had to be ritually prepared. They all went through a mass circumcision at Gilgal, which the text says removed the reproach of Egypt. This was a fundamental cleansing and a recommitment.
So what was the reproach of Egypt, really? Was it just that they had been slaves?
It was deeper than slavery. The reproach symbolized their status as an uncommitted people, spiritually tainted by the idolatry and degradation of Egypt. And that was compounded by the disobedience of the older generation who died in the wilderness. So by receiving the sign of the covenant now, right on the border, they were basically saying, we are no longer defined by our past slavery or our wandering unbelief. We are defined by our dedication to Yahweh. This act of covenant renewal meant they were spiritually ready to possess the land and enter into the promised rest. And that rest was this state of, delightful existence, where their enemies were defeated and they lived in fellowship with their king. But crucially, that rest depended entirely on their continued faithfulness.
Which brings us perfectly to the conquest itself. If the land was a gift, then the victory needed to take the land also had to be delivered as a gift. That way, absolutely no credit could go to human military strength.
The conquest is the demonstration of this principle in action. It's not a story of tactical genius. It's a story of pure supernatural help. The Battle of Jericho is the ultimate, almost comical example. The strategy given by the commander, marching around a huge fortified city for 7 days and then having priests blow trumpets while the people shout. It was patently absurd from a military point of view.
If you propose that battle plan at West Point today, you'd be laughed out of the room. No rational strategy relies on sound waves and a religious ceremony to bring down stone walls.
The complete bizarre nature of the strategy was the whole point. It guaranteed, beyond any doubt, that Israel could not say the victory was because of their siege weapons or their courage. It was a holy war fought by the Lord himself. The people were basically just performing a liturgical parade and then shouting. They were witnesses to the fact that Yahweh was the true divine warrior.
And this divine warfare goes way beyond just collapsing walls. Our sources detail these astonishing events during the campaigns against the southern and northern coalitions. They confirm Yahweh was actively fighting on the front lines.
The southern campaign, especially against the coalition led by the king of Jerusalem, is fascinating. When Israel's army engaged them, the Lord intervened, throwing Israel's enemies into total confusion. But the real miracle happened when the Lord threw massive hailstones down from the sky. The sources say that more people died from the hailstones than from Israel's swords.
That's a powerful detail. The elements themselves were fighting against the enemies of the covenant, but then, of course, we get to the cosmic miracle, the centerpiece of the whole supernatural intervention.
Yes, for Israel to get the complete victory before dark, Yahweh did the unthinkable. He stopped the cosmic clock. He made the sun stand still over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Ajalon for about a whole day. This act of just staggering cosmic control makes the narrator's summary undeniable. The Lord fought for Israel. Swords and bows and human plans were just completely insignificant compared to the intervention of the sovereign king who controls the stars.
And if that wasn't enough to show total divine rule, the sources highlight God's control over the very minds of Israel's enemies.
This might be the most absolute demonstration of sovereignty. Regarding the northern coalition, led by Jabin, king of Hazor, the text tells us explicitly that it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts. So they would come out and fight Israel. This wasn't just God knowing what would happen, it was active control. God decreed their destruction, and then he shaped their wills and desires so they would choose the path that led right to their own annihilation. This shows that Yahweh reigns absolutely, orchestrating even the actions of his enemies to fulfill his plan.
So given that the land and the victory were total gifts secured by this divine warrior, we have to look at the man on the ground, Joshua, the one who looked like the general in charge. I mean, he certainly appeared to be holding all the authority.
Joshua's authority was immense. The sources describe it as a kingly role. He was Moses' chosen successor, and Israel was told to obey him just as they obeyed Moses. Joshua commanded the armies, he executed the enemies, he delivered God's word, and maybe most symbolically, he was the one who allotted the land to the tribes. In a lot of ways, he's a forerunner of the future kings in Israel.
He had the title, he wore the uniform, he gave the commands, he looked like the supreme commander. Yet the narrative includes a scene that seems designed specifically to puncture that illusion, to make it clear that Joshua was not the ultimate leader, he was just a subordinate.
That defining moment happens right before the conquest begins, near Jericho. Joshua sees this mysterious man standing in front of him with a sword drawn, ready for battle. And Joshua, showing his military mindset, asks, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And the man responds with his title, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord."
And the sources, based on what happens next, imply very strongly that this figure is a pre-incarnate appearance of Yahweh himself, taking the role of the supreme general.
The reaction and the command confirm it. Joshua immediately falls face down on the ground in worship, asking what his Lord commands. And he's then told to remove his sandals, "For the place where you stand is holy." This is a very deliberate, direct parallel to what happened to Moses at the burning bush.
The theological meaning is impossible to miss. This encounter stripped Joshua of any illusion of being the supreme authority. He was immediately demoted, or maybe you could say promoted, from the chief field general to a subordinate officer. The real leader of the conquest was there, on the ground, and in command.
That's the core insight. Joshua was a viceroy. He had delegated authority. But the moment the supreme commander-in-chief showed up, he had to acknowledge that his success, his strategy, his very right to stand on holy ground is all dependent on the grace and the plan of the divine warrior. Victory wasn't going to depend on Joshua's tactics, but on his obedience to his superior.
And the narrative makes sure we don't forget this lesson. It immediately gives us examples of what happens when Joshua tries to rely on his own judgment.
We see two clear failures. The first is the initial defeat at Ai. After the huge success at Jericho, Joshua felt confident. He sent a small spy team. They came back and said the city was weak. Let not all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai.
He relied on human intelligence. He underestimated the enemy and just assumed the victories would keep rolling in automatically.
And crucially, he did this without consulting the commander of the Lord's army. He relied on his own human wisdom and his staff's assessment. The result was a total rout. About 36 men were killed, and the entire nation panicked. It was a sharp, bloody lesson that victory doesn't come through human calculation, even if it seems sound. It comes only through divine instruction.
The second big failure is the deception by the Gibeonites, which also shows Joshua failing to consult the true authority.
Yes. The Gibeonites famously came to Joshua in ragged clothes, pretending to be from a distant land, asking for a peace treaty. And Joshua and the elders with him were completely fooled by the disguise, and the sources tell us plainly. But they did not ask counsel from the mouth of the Lord. If they had just asked the commander, they would have known the truth and obeyed the instruction not to make treaties with the people of the land. Joshua failed because he relied on how things looked and his own discernment. He forgot his primary duty was submission and asking for orders. His leadership was only effective when it mirrored the commander's plan.
This necessary submission, Joshua constantly having to yield to the commander, brings us to the central tension of the covenant and the land. The land and the victories were pure gifts of grace, but that grace demanded a response from the people.
The structure of the covenant is very clear, and it reflects the whole nature of redemption. Grace comes before obedience. The indicative comes before the imperative. Yahweh delivered Israel from Egypt first, establishing who they were, and then he gave them the law. The land was secured by divine power, and then they were expected to live rightly in it.
So obedience isn't a way of earning the gift, but it's the necessary expression of gratitude, and it's the condition for keeping your tenure in that gift.
The response had to be total internal faithfulness. Joshua told them again and again they had to respond in grateful obedience and trust. This meant serving Yahweh with all your heart and with all your soul, which specifically required them to reject the worship of other gods and not assimilate into the pagan culture around them.
That focus on remaining in the land, enjoying the rest, makes it a conditional gift. You get the land for free, but you stay there through continued faithfulness to the king. And if they failed that requirement, they faced the same judgment the Canaanites had.
And we immediately see how serious this covenant faithfulness is through the stark contrast the narrative gives us between two men, Achan, who represents the way of the curse, and Caleb, who represents the way of the blessing.
Achan's sin at Jericho is pivotal. It shows just how fragile their corporate identity was and how severe it is to live in God's presence.
It's the moment that proves how serious living in this outpost of Yahweh's lordship really is. Despite seeing the miracle of Jericho, Achan violated the ban, the harem. The harem meant that certain spoils were totally devoted, either for destruction or dedicated to the Lord's treasury as holy objects. And Achan took a cloak from Schreiner, some silver, and a bar of gold.
This wasn't just petty theft. This was a desecration of a holy war.
Precisely. By taking things that were devoted to Yahweh, Achan's individual sin had catastrophic corporate consequences. The text says that the anger of the Lord burned against the whole nation. The entire corporate body of Israel was now devoted for destruction until that contamination was removed. The sin of one man jeopardized the gracious presence of the king for millions of people, and it led directly to the defeat at 8. It showed that holiness is absolutely non-negotiable when the king is living among his people.
And the severity of the punishment. Achan, his family, all his possessions were stoned and burned in the valley of Achor. It really underscores this. It proved Israel could be just as much an enemy of God as the Canaanites if they broke the terms of their residence.
Now contrast that tragic failure with Caleb. He's presented as Achan's polar opposite. Caleb had already shown 40 years earlier that he wholly followed the Lord my God. He showed total faithfulness when the 10 other spies refused to trust Yahweh's promise.
And his reward in Joshua's time wasn't just any piece of land, it was a challenging territory. The mountains of Hebron, which he then had to go and clear of giants. He asked for the hardest assignment.
Caleb's faithfulness was rewarded with a specific, hard-won blessing and inheritance. He relied completely on Yahweh's strength, he drove out the giants, and he secured his portion. He represents the ideal Israelite, someone who receives the gift of land by grace and then responds with trusting, zealous obedience and secures his rest. The contrast between Achan's failure, which brought judgment, and Caleb's faithfulness, which brought blessing, just highlights the absolute stakes of covenant faithfulness.
Yet, despite these clear examples of Achan and Caleb, the narrative closes on this deeply ambiguous note. It casts a shadow over Israel's future.
Yes. After Joshua renews the covenant at Shechem, reminding them of God's entire redemptive history all the way from Abraham. He gives them this stunning challenge. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. But if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve. And the people declare, we will serve Yahweh.
But Joshua's response is so unsettling. He basically tells them, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God.
That is the devastating realization that closes the book. God had fulfilled every single promise. They had the land, the new garden, they were enjoying rest, and yet their hearts proved they were still in Adam, repeating the failure of the first vice-regent. They could not maintain the required faithfulness because of the weakness in their own sinful nature. This lack of heart capacity, along with the notes about incomplete conquest, it all signals that the Mosaic covenant and human leadership just weren't enough to secure true, lasting, eternal rest.
This canonical tension. The physical promises are fulfilled, but the people can't live up to the requirements. It forces the whole story forward. It points beyond Joshua, the temporary general, and Moses, the temporary mediator.
This systemic failure reveals the need for a true, competent solution. A true new Adam, a king and final prophet who has to come from the line of Judah. This promised king has to be able to do what corporate Israel could not, live in perfect, total, unswerving faithfulness to Yahweh while ruling his outpost.
This coming king is the prophesied solution to the dilemma created by the failure of the human heart, even in the new garden.
And the sources connect this figure directly back to the original promise in Genesis 3:15. They affirm that this king from Judah is the one who won't just bring temporary regional judgment, but will finally secure the decisive, permanent victory. He's the one who will crush the head of the serpent and bring the promise of global blessing to its final state, securing an eternal inheritance for his people. The physical, temporary victories of Joshua, like putting his feet on the necks of defeated kings, they were just echoes and shadows. The final checkmate requires this ultimate, faithful sovereign.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the lesson really stays constant across the entire arc of this history. It starts with the sovereign call of Abraham, and it culminates in Joshua's temporary, incomplete rest. And the lesson is this: the kingdom of God is inaugurated, secured, and advanced purely by divine grace.
It began with the non-meritorious choice of an idolater. It proceeded through supernatural, elemental acts of deliverance, the Ark of the Covenant, leading them into the Jordan and around Jericho. And it was secured by military victories that were achieved through counterintuitive strategies designed to get rid of any human boasting. Joshua secured a wonderful physical inheritance, but Israel's revealed inability to maintain that rest because of their sinful hearts. Well, it casts the entire rest of the story of Scripture in a necessary light.
It forces us to confront the fact that just having the garden isn't enough. The heart of the vice-regent has to be perfect and incorruptible to live eternally in the king's presence.
That is the precise point the narrative isolates. Since the human heart, including Israel's heart in the new garden, proved it was incapable of maintaining covenant faithfulness. What did this future king from Judah, this necessary new Adam who was destined to succeed where the first one failed, what did he have to accomplish differently, both inside himself and externally, to secure eternal residence and global blessing for his people? That is the ultimate question this deep dive leaves with you to consider.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Reformed thinking. We hope this knowledge brings clarity to your understanding of the story of redemption.